The Battle of the Chongchon River, also known as the Battle of the Chongchon or the Second Phase Campaign Western Sector, was a decisive battle in the Korean War, and it took place from November 25 to December 2 in 1950, along the Chongchon River Valley in the northwestern part of North Korea. In response to the successful Chinese First Phase campaign against the United Nations forces, General Douglas MacArthur launched the Home by Christmas offensive to evict the Chinese forces from Korea and to end the war. Anticipating this reaction, the Chinese People's Volunteer Army commander Peng Dehuai planned a counter-offensive dubbed the Second Phase Campaign against the advancing UN forces. Hoping to repeat the success of the earlier First Phase campaign, the Chinese 13th Army first launched a series of surprise attacks along the Chongchon River Valley on the night of November 25, 1950, effectively destroying the 8th United States Army's right flank while allowing Chinese forces to move rapidly into UN rear areas. In the subsequent battles and withdrawals during the period of November 26 to December 2, 1950, although the U.S. 8th Army managed to avoid being surrounded by Chinese forces, the Chinese 13th Army were still able to inflict heavy losses onto the retreating UN forces, which had lost all cohesion. In the aftermath of the battle, the U.S. 8th Army's heavy losses forced all UN forces to evacuate North Korea and to withdraw to the 38th parallel. Background: well, if they go fast enough, maybe some of them can be home by Christmas. General Douglas MacArthur, in the wake of the United Nations forces' successful landing at Incheon and the subsequent destruction of the Korean People's Army by mid-1950, the 8th United States Army crossed the 38th parallel and advanced rapidly towards the Sino-Korean border. Alarmed by this development, China's chairman Mao Zedong ordered the Chinese People's Volunteer Army to intervene in Korea and to launch the First Phase campaign against the UN forces. Between October 25 and November 4, 1950, the PVA 13th Army surprised and defeated the Republic of Korea 2nd Corps and the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division in a series of battles around Dongjongin and Zhàn, destroying the right flank of the U.S. 8th Army while forcing the UN forces to retreat back to the Chongchon River. Although Chinese forces were able to break through the UN line, logistics difficulties forced the Chinese to withdraw on November 5, 1950. Despite the success of the Chinese First Phase campaign, the UN planners still believed that China had not intervened in Korea on a large scale. The suddenness of the Chinese withdrawal in the face of a victory further reinforced this belief. Working on the assumption that only 30,000 Chinese troops could remain hidden in the hills, General Douglas MacArthur ordered the bombing of the bridges over the Yalu River in an effort to cut off Chinese reinforcements. Confident that the UN Air Force could detect and disrupt any troop movements across the Yalu River, MacArthur launched the Home by Christmas offensive on November 24 to rout the remaining Chinese and North Korean forces and to end the Korean War. Unknown to the UN planners, however, there were already 180,000 Chinese troops stationed in Korea, with more reinforcements infiltrating across the border. Although the PVA was ordered to maintain a defensive posture in North Korea until Soviet weapons could arrive in the spring of 1951, its earlier successes convinced the Chinese leadership that the PVA was capable of turning the tide of UN advance. Encouraged by the fact that the UN did not know their true numbers, PVA Commander Peng Dehuai outlined the Second Phase campaign, a counter-offensive aimed at pushing the UN forces back to a line halfway between Chongchon River and Pyongyang, as a part of a deception plan to further reinforce the weak appearance of Chinese forces. Peng ordered all units to rapidly retreat north while releasing POWs along the way. With 230,000 troops at his disposal and another 150,000 heading to the Chosin Reservoir, Peng authorized the start of the Second Phase campaign on November 22, 1950. Prelude, location, terrain and whether the battle was fought along the UN front line around the Chongchon River and its tributaries, which is located 50 miles south of the Sino-Korean border. The UN front line stretched horizontally from the Korean west coast to the Taebaek Mountains in central Korea, while the Chongchon River crosses into the north of the UN line at the town of Kujangdong. From west to east, a series of towns, such as Cheongju, Yongsan-dong, Ipseok, Kujangdong, Tokchon, and Yongwon dot the front line, and connecting those towns are a series of road junctions located at Sinanju, Anju, Kunuri and Pukchang-ni. A road runs south from Kunuri into Suncheon and eventually into Pyongyang, and it would later become the main retreat route for the UN forces stationed at the center of the front line. The hilly terrains on the northern bank of the Chongchon River formed a defensive barrier that allowed the Chinese to hide their presence while dispersing the advancing UN forces. The battle was also fought over one of the coldest Korean winters in 100 years, with temperatures dropped to as low as -30 degrees Fahrenheit. On November 24, 1950, with a reconstituted ROK Second Corps placed on the 8th Army's right flank, the advance was led by the U.S. First Corps to the west, U.S. Ninth Corps in the center, and the ROK Second Corps to the east. The three UN corps advanced cautiously in a continuous front line in order to prevent more ambushes similar to the Chinese first phase campaign, but the lack of manpower stretched the UN forces to the limit. Except for the strong Chinese resistances against the ROK Second Corps, the 8th Army met little opposition, and the line between Cheongju to Yongwon was occupied on the night of the November 25th. Despite the lack of manpower, the U.S. 8th Army had 3.5 times the firepower of the opposing Chinese forces. The U.S. 5th Air Force, which was responsible for the air support, also had little opposition due to the lack of anti-aircraft weapons by the Chinese. Boosted by a Thanksgiving feast with roasted turkeys on the eve of the advance, the morale was high among the UN ranks, and home by Christmas and Germany by spring was in everyone's mind. The high morale, however, caused a degradation of troop discipline, and most of the soldiers had discarded their equipment and ammunition supply before the battle. A rifle company from the U.S. Ninth Corps, for example, started its advance with most of the helmets and bayonets thrown away, and there were on average less than 1 grenade and 50 rounds of ammunition carried per man. Because the UN planners did not foresee that the war would be dragged into a winter campaign, all elements of the 8th Army started the offensive with a shortage of winter clothing. While the 8th Army was advancing, the PVA 13th Army was hiding in the mountains with the 50th and 66th Corps to the west, the 39th and the 40th Corps in the center and the 38th and 42nd Corps to the east. Anticipating the UN advances, the Chinese planned a series of counterattacks to catch the 8th Army off guard, hoping to repeat the success of the earlier first phase campaign. The 38th and 42nd Corps would first attack the ROK Second Corps and to destroy the UN right flank, then cut behind the UN lines. At the same time, the 39th and 40th Corps would hold the U.S. Ninth Corps in place while preventing any reinforcements to the ROK Second Corps. The 50th and 66th Corps would stay behind and check the advances of the U.S. First Corps. Although the PVA 13th Army had a nominal strength of 230,000 men, its actual strength during the battle could be as low as 150,000 men. The PVA 66th Corps, for example, had only 6,600 men per division at the start of the battle, as opposed to the expected 10,000 men per division. There were also only one firearm available for every 3 Chinese soldiers, and the rest were employed as grenade throwers. Because most of the Chinese howitzers and guns were left behind in Manchuria, mortars were the only artillery support available for the Chinese. For the counter-offensive, the average Chinese soldier were issued with only 5 days' worth of rations and ammunition, and resupply could only be obtained by scavenging on the battlefield. To compensate for its shortcomings, the Chinese relied extensively on night attacks and infiltrations in order to avoid the UN firepower. The primitive logistics system had also allowed the Chinese to maneuver over the rough hilly terrains, thus enabled them to bypass the UN defenses and to surround the isolated UN positions. Because the Chinese had captured large numbers of nationalist weapons during the Chinese Civil War, most of the Chinese weapons were composed of US-made small arms such as the Thompson submachine guns, the M1 Garand rifle, the M1918 Browning automatic rifle, the bazooka and the M2 mortar.